We are following Jesus step by step through the Gospel of Matthew, and we are still right at the beginning when Jesus calls his disciples in Matthew 4 verse 18 and next few verses. He calls them with the words, "Come follow me," and we will explore what that meant. In Matthew chapter 4 we find a template, a framework of three different aspects that fits nicely together, that sort of in the end holds together the whole book. The first is the announcing of the kingdom. With Jesus being present, the king is here. Immediately after the announcing of the kingdom, disciple making is on the table. And that is what we will start with today. And we already can see a little bit of the third one, and that is transformation. Because where the king is present and he gathers people in through disciple making, the world is going to change. And that is what we will be looking at somewhat later. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will make you fishers of men." At once they left their nets and followed him. If we look at the cultural background of this section of the Gospel of Matthew, there are a few interesting things that may help us. At first, the disciples were most probably teenagers. No, they were not old men with beards. Later on they had grey beards when they were much older. But in this culture, a rabbi would have disciples that were teenagers from the age of 12, 13, and exceptionally the early 20s. If we look at this group of disciples, only Peter most probably was over 20, because he was the only one except Jesus who was eligible for tax. When we get to that story in Matthew, we will come back to this again. The others were still teenagers, as was quite normal in that culture, and also part of the old extra biblical records of the 2nd century, where there are even mention of John being 9, 10 years old. So most probably the disciples were teenagers. And the second thing to remember is that when Jesus called them, they knew very little about Jesus. They might have seen him walk by, they might have heard a few stories about him, but this is at the beginning of his ministry. And apart from the fact that he was an up-and-coming rabbi, a very young rabbi, a vigorous rabbi, a rabbi with interesting teaching, they probably knew very, very little about him. For sure, they didn't know anything about the cross and what the salvation will mean when all of those things will happen, which were far, far away in the future. So they actually knew very little about Jesus, apart from the fact that he was a rabbi. And the third thing is that they were the rejects. They were not good enough to follow any rabbi. You will remember that in other parts of the New Testament, they were even called illiterate, people who cannot really read and write the way educated people would do. They were not educated. And we can see that because they were still with their fathers in the boat, that they were probably working on the boats and the nets, that they most probably were teenagers who dropped out of school, didn't complete their schooling, otherwise they would have been following a rabbi, and they were just following the family trade. Young teenagers who never would have passed the level of knowledge of the Old Testament, knowing the first 5 books by heart, knowing many of the other parts of the Old Testament by heart, understanding the debates between the different rabbis. You had to do all of that before you could follow a rabbi, especially a rabbi with authority. And they did not make it. So the picture up to now is that we've got some teenagers who actually knew very little about Jesus at that point, and that they were not good enough to follow any rabbi. But they followed him nonetheless. Now that brings us to some questions that may impact our approach to our ministry. And the first one is, how much faith do you need to have before taking the first step? Now, how much faith did the young disciples have? Not much. Maybe like a mustard seed. Enough faith to take the first step, to see where Jesus will lead. And as they saw more of him and heard more about what he said, their faith and their understanding grew. And we will see throughout the Gospel of Matthew how Jesus helps them over different hurdles of understanding and of following, again and again, giving them opportunity again to respond to the question, follow me. Will you follow me? Do you still want to follow me? Exactly when they were saved, according to the way that we might think today, we don't know. The Bible doesn't teach that. But what we know is that in following Jesus, they were on a road that eventually led to salvation. Which brings us to another question. Who did Jesus choose to follow him? He didn't choose the best educated or the most senior people in the community, or those whose lives had been worthy of following a rabbi. He called the rejects, those who were not good enough. And we will see throughout the Gospel of Matthew, as Jesus calls more and more and more people, he seems to deliberately look for those who are rejected by the rest of society. And when Paul starts to follow Jesus, he does exactly the same. So it seems that instead of looking for the mighty and the wise and the rich, Jesus is looking for the broken people who are despised. So the question is, where will you start? You have to think about this. You have to think about the last 2 sets of questions and then read this passage again. How will you start? With whom will you start? I've got another question that I just would like to throw in here. Would it be possible for someone who doesn't believe in God, or someone from a different religion, to start following Jesus, to take that first step, without being a Christian? Just because he or she might be interested, or curious, or in some way touched by this man Jesus. I think if you start reaching out to people in the same way that Jesus did, you will experience the same result as he did. because that was his promise. So read this passage again, and even the next few verses, where some other disciples are being called in exactly the same way. And ask the Lord to reveal his strategy for your ministry. God bless you.